Modern geopolitical power relies on an invisible foundation, the structural evolution of the US dollar. Long before modern finance, early civilizations relied on barter, but trading physical goods like grain or livestock was a logistical nightmare. There was no standardized way to measure value, and agricultural goods would simply rot before a long-distance trade could be completed. The Kingdom of Lydia solved this by creating a universally accepted substitute. They minted gold into small, easily transportable discs and standardized their weight. This worked locally, but as global trade expanded, a new problem emerged. Moving massive quantities of wealth meant loading heavy chests of gold onto ships, exposing merchants to pirate attacks and shipwrecks. To bypass the danger, merchants developed early proxy systems. Instead of moving physical gold, they deposited it in secure vaults and traveled with stamped, signed paper IOUs that could be redeemed at their destination.
Paper money, at its inception, held zero intrinsic value. It was invented strictly as a lightweight, convenient claim on physical wealth stored somewhere else. Out of pure logistical convenience and deep trust in that physical anchor, the international community crowned the US dollar as the undisputed global reserve currency. By the late 1960s, a severe structural flaw emerged. Driven by the costs of the Vietnam War and aggressive domestic spending programs, the U.S. government started printing far more dollars than it had gold to back them. As the money supply expanded, inflation rose. Foreign nations realized their paper dollars were rapidly losing purchasing power, so they began demanding their physical gold back. By 1971, the math was impossible to ignore. If the United States continued to honor its Bretton Woods obligations, its gold vaults would be completely drained. Facing a total collapse of American reserves, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended a dollar's convertibility to gold, severing the currency entirely from physical reality. This established the fiat currency system, a money supply backed by the government's word and the credibility of its institutions. Without a physical gold anchor, the world no longer had a logical reason to hold US dollars. This sudden lack of utility threatened to end American economic supremacy overnight. To prevent the dollar from collapsing, the US needed to artificially manufacture global demand. They needed to peg the currency to a new, indispensable physical commodity: oil. The US struck a geopolitical deal with Saudi Arabia and the broader OPEC coalition. In exchange for military protection and cooperation, these nations agreed to price the world's most vital resource exclusively in US dollars. This created the petrodollar loop. Because every economy requires energy, nations were forced to acquire US dollars to keep factories running. This granted America an exorbitant privilege, trading printed paper for the actual physical labor and goods of other countries. This chart shows the US dollar's share of global official reserves. Following the 1970s, central banks around the world hoarded dollars to ensure their national energy security, keeping that blue bar consistently high. The petrodollar successfully trapped the global economy. The US dollar mutated from an optional tool of convenience into an inescapable, mandatory global utility. Because the entire globe is now wired into U.S. capital markets to facilitate this trade, the U.S. government holds the choke points of international finance. This architecture enables financial weaponization. America no longer needs to drop physical bombs to cripple a nation. It can simply sever an adversary's access to the dollar system. The petrodollar system relies on exclusivity. When Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling oil in euros rather than dollars, he threatened the mandatory demand that keeps U.S. borrowing costs low. This direct challenge to the dollar's global necessity preceded the swift collapse of his regime. Muammar Gaddafi faced a similar fate after proposing a gold-backed African currency. By offering nations a way to trade oil without U.S. intermediaries, he threatened to allow the world to exit the dollar loop entirely, removing the primary mechanism used to finance the American deficit. By threatening secondary sanctions against any global bank that does business with a target, the U.S. effectively freezes an adversary's entire domestic economy overnight. We see this in Iran, where the sudden lack of dollar liquidity makes it impossible for the nation to participate in international trade. The sheer scale of this weapon was recently demonstrated against a major global power like Russia. where the U.S. used its control over payment systems to crash currency values and halt international trade with a single policy directive. A nation that can disconnect an adversary from the global market with a keystroke wields a power that military force cannot replicate. In the end, control over the money supply defines control over the world.